The High Holy Day Sermon. In the rabbi's world, it's kind of like Game 7 of the World Series, or at least Game 4 of the National League Division Series. Among my colleagues, we sometimes bemuse that our other 50 or so Shabbat sermons come and go. And what we say during the rest of the year, it will either be absorbed, forgiven, or most likely forgotten. But the High Holy Day Sermon expects some staying power, perhaps because it's offered at a time when we are more vulnerable, more willing to open the window to the heart that these days of awe require. Some of my colleagues feel, as Rabbi Debbie Bravo wrote, truth be told, we rabbis rarely say what we actually want to say. Too often we say either what we think people need to hear or what we feel obligated to share. But this year, the stakes seem higher. And many, including myself, have struggled, and I mean struggled, to boldly tackle the urgent issues which compel us while remaining compassionate, nonpartisan, true to oneself, and a supporter of everybody. Because remember, our 501c3 status is at stake if I don't. Yet each one of us comes to this day of atonement with the unending sounds and images that these days keep playing in our mind, and they weigh so heavily in our hearts. I read the same op-ed pieces that you read and get news via the same channels. I sit perplexed over the same meals and many discussions with many of you, trying to make sense of this world and the world's dilemmas that touch all of us so deeply. Violence, whether 20 miles away in Chicago or thousands of miles away in Aleppo, Syria. Intolerance, anti-Semitism, globally or on the college campus. Israel, Zionism, ISIS, and its unique brand of religious terrorism. And most painfully, in this country, where social and racial inequalities sit firmly embedded in so many of our institutions, and the discourse of intolerance assaults us daily, not to mention bigotry and contempt that plays out on our airways every single day. Perhaps it makes you question, as I do, where is the threshold of human dignity that we just can't be willing to cross? I've been haunted, truly haunted, by words that I read last March at the entryway of the permanent exhibit at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. The very first room that you walk into, the very first billboard, the very first board that's on display, attributed in 1933 to Kurt Tucholsky. It says, a country is not just what it does, it is also what it tolerates. As a rabbi, merely human, I'm filled with emotion and personal perspective. I have no clear solutions to address the crises on the world stage or the political debacle that seems to have taken the best of our public square hostage. But as a rabbi and as a member of this Jewish and American community, I must resist the sense that because there's so much, the best we can do is stand still and hope the world will right its course. This can't be the Jewish answer. If our history has taught us anything at all, it is that standing idly by is never, ever an option. For 2,000 years, Pirkei Avot teaches, in a place where there are no humans, strive to be one. And so with this spiritual imperative of the high holidays on the one hand, and the responsibility as a community member and religious leader on the other, ignoring the hard questions facing our country at such a crucial moment seems not only irresponsible, but actually inconceivable to me. The world needs our attention. Our country needs our attention. And perhaps there is no better time to address such a difficult subject than a day like this, when we sit in judgment before God for our mortal lives and we contemplate the very meaning of life, love, and our relationship with God and the rest of the world. No small task for a 22-minute sermon. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that self-contemplation on Yom Kippur as an end unto itself just isn't enough this year. True on Kol Nidre, perhaps more than any other moment of the year, we are filled with thoughts of what might have been, what could have been, what should have been. But this year, Yom Kippur must compel us to remember that our time here on this earth must never be wasted. I echo the words of my colleague, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove. We come to synagogue not to hear how the world is, but rather how the world ought to be. So let us leave the safe space behind and enter into the brave space where we define the conversation that we want to have. So, this sermon tonight is the sermon that I want to give. This sermon tonight is the sermon that I need to give. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter." The state of affairs in our country is calling us to look long and hard at the lives we intend to lead. And with engaged consciousness, say out loud to our neighbors, to our friends, to parents, and to children, what kind of human beings, Jews, American citizens, what kind of citizen do we want to be? What are we willing to tolerate? This will require us to ask and answer some really hard questions. Hard question number one: am I making the world more human? And if not, am I contributing to its intolerance? In the book of Genesis, God created different kinds of plants and a whole array of animals and creepy crawly things, very, very specific, animal after animal, plant after plant. But in contrast, the Torah does not say that God created different kinds of humans, people of different colors or different races. The Torah teaches us instead that God created one single human being from which we all ascend. Adam wasn't black or white. He wasn't gay or straight. He wasn't a Republican or a Democrat. Adam was our common ancestor. Elie Wiesel taught a Jew cannot remain indifferent to human suffering, whether in other countries or in our own cities and towns. The mission, the true mission of the Jewish people has never been to make the world more Jewish, but rather to make the world more human. To elevate humanity is perhaps too much for any one of us to take on. But to make the world more human begins with one very fundamental belief: that the lives being damaged or berated or lost in our country every single day, those lives, no matter where they are, matter. When we turn away or pretend that intolerance for anyone, people of color, women, the poor, the veteran, the immigrant, the wealthy, the disenfranchised. When we tolerate this intolerance, we are part of a rupture in our own human dignity, and we are at odds. We are at odds with our Jewish teachings. I put to us all what Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in challenging our human selves. Have we failed, he wrote, to demand, to insist, to challenge, and to chastise? Some of us are guilty, but all of us are responsible. We have a moral obligation to resist apathy, or worse, powerlessness. Whether to the person next to you or your colleague in the boardroom or the masses on your Facebook feed, what stops us from raising our voices? What person here would not say to themselves, racial or social or human intolerance is simply not tolerable? To make the world more human, you must intervene in the discourse, looking squarely at the twofold stakes for not doing so. The degradation of real lives. Lack of access has its litany of data points, and the ultimate price in lives lost is clear. As of last Monday, 3,200 people have been shot on the streets of Chicago, 930 more than the exact same time the year before. 568 have been killed from January 1st until October 1st. 172 more than that same time period last year. Every week we read those names at services of those killed by violence, and I so feel that loss. But I feel helpless. These are human brothers and sisters, 20, 30 miles from where I live. But as a rabbi, it's the degradation of the human spirit that truly devastates. When we allow intolerance to go unchecked by us as individuals, it soon becomes part of an untold community landscape until we find ourselves part of an impassive nation, watching quietly, perhaps demeaned or even in disbelief, as would-be leaders assert that intolerance or bigotry or hate is a valid ethnic in our pursuit of life, liberty, and freedom. A country is not just what it does. A country is also what it tolerates. Hard question number 2. Am I on the sidelines or am I really in the game? I came to this question while chaperoning the 11th and 12th grade civil rights trip to Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham, and Atlanta last February. Making this trip at that time said volumes about the pursuit of self-understanding that I would feel, that I truly felt as an American. As I stood early Saturday morning leading Shabbat services at the base of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I read these words by Lyndon Johnson when he spoke to Congress, acknowledging the Voters' Rights Act. He said, "At times, history and fate meet in a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. And so it was last week in Selma." For me, growing up in Pennsylvania, my parents, as we drove the Pennsylvania highway, my parents made sure that I visited Gettysburg and Appomattox and several other Civil War sites every time we drove out east to visit our relatives. As a newlywed, we traveled to Boston to visit some friends, but we made sure to visit Lexington and Concord following the midnight ride of Paul Revere. But why? Why did it take until I was 52 years old for me to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And why? Why were we the only people there that morning? There were no long lines of buses. There were no souvenir shops. We were hauntingly alone. This trip, which we will repeat twice this coming year, both for adults and for students, opened the eyes of the real difference between sitting on the sidelines and choosing to be in the game. 10 teenagers and 2 chaperones stepped out of the textbook to consider and to feel American history and civil rights and the truth about race in our country in a whole new way. We all listened and we learned and we read and we were moved beyond words at the sites and memorials where the familiar heroes that we all know came to life. It was an absolute thrill for me to stand on the steps of the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, the very first pulpit that Dr. Martin Luther King assumed when he moved from Boston to come down to the South. It was chilling to look at the bus stop and to see the exact spot that Rosa Parks got on that bus that day. And it was so moving to travel to Birmingham and to visit the 16th Avenue Baptist Church, where on a Sunday morning a bomb was planted at the side door and 4 beautiful little girls were blown up. But then from there, we moved in closer with the lesser-known narratives of young people, just like the young people that we were with, who stepped off the sidelines, and we learned about what it cost them. Jimmy Lee Jackson. I never knew that name before. Jimmy Lee Jackson was an African-American farmer who turned political activist only because for 4 years he unsuccessfully attempted to register to vote. He was beaten to death while peacefully demonstrating. His funeral in early March sparked a 1,000-person processional led by Dr. King. And it was after Jimmy Lee Jackson's funeral that they decided that we need to march to Montgomery, to the state capitol, to change the laws, to do it for Jimmy. We learned about Viola, a woman who was living in Detroit who said, people are just talking about civil rights, but we got to do something. So she came down, and she helped out in Selma wherever she could. And she marched the last 5 miles. And then she was part of the shuttle service that drove people back to Selma. And she drove a group back, and then she drove back to Montgomery. And on the way back, the Ku Klux Klan killed her. And we saw where she was buried. We saw that monument. A woman from Detroit who wanted to make a difference. But she didn't do it for any other reason than she felt a passion. But even more than the people that we read about in textbooks, the amazing thing about this trip were the real citizens living there today. Joanna Bland, the woman who at age 11 had already been arrested 13 times in her life. She would get arrested, she would go to jail, she would come out of jail, she would have a meal, and then she would get arrested again. She tried to walk the bridge on Bloody Sunday, but couldn't get on the bridge because there were too many people. But now, she talks to groups, and she tells her story. And as we gathered at Brown's church, where everyone else gathered, she gathered the kids in close and she said, go to that back parking lot right there, the place where they haven't paved yet, and grab some stones, because those stones were there when we were there. And she said, pick up some stones and take them with you, because you're touching history. And so we did. These stones are still on my desk. I was most impressed with a man named Mark Peterson, who graduated from an Ivy League school. And he made some money in the computer business in Atlanta, and he wanted to come home to Selma. And he's trying to buy the St. James Hotel. And now he's working as the front desk clerk and the waiter in the restaurant. And I just read that at the end of the summer, his offer was denied, and he was not able to buy the hotel. But he's still going to keep trying. The favorite woman I met was Martha Hawkins from Montgomery. She was part of a group that made sandwiches for all of the marchers crossing the bridge that Sunday. She now owns Martha's Place, a local hometown favorite restaurant. These people, real people, drive home what it means for just regular people to step off the sidelines and to make an impact in the place where history and fate meet to shape a turning point in our unending search for freedom. I think our kids on that trip found themselves challenged to consider what it means to be in the game when history really matters. 50 years ago, we Jews were on that bridge with Dr. King. But I think what troubles me most right now is that this time around, I can't help but to feel that we're not even at the table. We haven't stepped up, or we haven't been invited to step up. Where's our national leadership of any major organization truly taking a stand with what's happening in our world? And as I stand here on this most holy of days, it's not lost on me that our young people, our emerging adults, have a huge stake in where we stand at these times. I pray that we are modeling the kind of integrity and respect that we expect from them as they manage their way. A respect and integrity no less than we expect from every one of our elected officials. Hard question number 3. How much is enough? What can I do to leave room? What can I do to leave my comfort zone? As an individual during such a critical time, I can take no fair measure of any one person's stand. But as a rabbi, I will ask you to consider your role in our human endeavor. As Martin Buber so beautifully wrote in his book, Hasidism and the Modern Man, he posed that each individual must search their own heart, choose their particular way, bring about the unity of their being, and begin with the self. But Buber was clear that the quest is not for the sake of the individual alone. He concluded, to begin with oneself but not end with oneself, to start from oneself but not aim at oneself, to comprehend oneself but not to be preoccupied with oneself. For me, this teaching answers the question, how much is enough? Today we are summoned to begin with ourselves. That's what today is all about. To examine clearly what we truly believe about people, like those who are like us, and yes, those who are different from us. We as Jews willingly call ourselves to task for our own apathy, for our own fear, for our judgments. But in the end, with only ourselves, our quiet comfort or discomfort with the world at hand is not going to be enough. Hillel taught, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? When is today. Today is about acknowledging that all lives matter and that we have the power to choose how we're going to live with the values that we hold sacred. Our vote in 28 days is of utmost importance. So if we leave this precious space more aware of our own complacency with intolerance and injustice, but give our neighbor no sign that we mean to challenge it in the public square, then our aim will fall short. Think about it. We filter our Facebook feed so that we only get the exact kind of news and the world that we want to experience. We can order food just how we like it. We're all individuals and we live in our own isolated little bubbles all day long. We say hi and exchange pleasantries, but remain firmly entrenched in our little bubble. We share a street with hundreds, if not thousands of others, but in our consciousness, only my worries matter. We may have hundreds of Facebook friends. We may have plenty of colleagues and people to chat with. But who among us knows what's really going on in each other's lives? What's going on in each other's hearts? Who are we going to call when there's an emergency at 2:30 in the morning? On this Yom Kippur, our individuality has a calling and a challenge to break us out of our bubbles because our very human dignity is truly at stake. As I begin my fast on this Kol Nidre, Isaiah's cry from tomorrow's Haftorah summons me past self-awareness. Isaiah says, "Is not this the fast I desire, to break the bonds of injustice and remove the heavy yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to recognize my prejudice and my fears?" Isaiah's call is louder this year than it's ever been before. To act, to stand, to care, to make a difference, to get off the bench, to do my part. The ultimate command of the Torah. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. But the text doesn't say do justice when it feels right, when it's safe, when it's convenient. The text is very clear. Pursue justice. Justice must be pursued all the time, especially when it's difficult, especially when it's complex, especially when our values are called into question. Even when others don't express the same values as ours, we must pursue justice. So how are you going to do it? How do you make yourself more human, place yourself in the game, and push yourself from awareness to a meaningful stand? Truth be told, sadly, I don't have an answer. Because for each and every one of us, it's different. Maybe you'll join. Maybe you'll help go register people to vote in our state or in a neighboring state. Maybe you'll become a mentor downtown or in Waukegan. Maybe you'll give money or time to a worthy organization that we know is making a difference. Maybe you won't just make sandwiches on Sunday morning, but you'll deliver those sandwiches to those on the south side. Maybe you'll come visit the church that we help support in Lawndale. Maybe you'll read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, and discuss it with us. Maybe you'll really enter into a political discussion with someone who has an opposite view of yours and hash it out civilly. Maybe this year you'll join us in Selma, or you'll invite your kids to join us in Selma. I do truly believe that it is spiritually significant and morally imperative for us as Jews to stand against the devaluing of humanity at any level, because when we do, we actually infuse some hope into what may seem desperate times. The chief rabbi of England, Lord Jonathan Sacks, teaches, optimism and hope aren't the same. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better. Hope is the belief that together we make the world better. Whether you are an optimist or not, this is a passive virtue. Tonight I'm advocating hope. The courage to be heard when history really matters. Given our history of suffering, Jews were rarely optimists. But we never, ever gave up hope. No matter what we see, no matter what we experience, no matter who gets elected, we still have to have hope. We are blessed and we are holy. We are children of your way, and the words that bring us meaning, we will have the strength to say, Lador vador nagid godlecha, from generation to generation. That's who we are. That's who we've been for 2,000 years. That's what we believe. That's the core of our existence. And despite the tensions of the moment, Americans absolutely aspire to be united in the highest sense of national purpose and common cause. As Jews and as humans, it's time to summon America once again to its highest calling as a champion of liberty, humanity, and decency. On this night of nights, we can tolerate no less than that. Amen.